So today I wanted to give a presentation on contemporary and other early sources for Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage, particularly naming Joseph Smith's plural wives, as well as several contemporary sources that give the marriage date for specific wives. And this is because one common claim by polygamy skeptics or polygamy deniers is that all this is late sources. It's all very, very late. And so, we shouldn't trust all the late sources, but the reality is there's a lot of significant contemporary evidence of Joseph Smith's polygamy, both him teaching it as well as practicing it. And this is going to be some of the strong evidence for Joseph Smith's plural wives in contemporary and early Nauvoo period sources. So there's 5 plural marriages of Joseph Smith's, which are privately recorded contemporaneously in friendly journals in the Nauvoo period. There's Agnes Smith, there's Sarah Ann Whitney, there's Lucy Walker, there's Rhoda Richards, and there's Melissa Lott, which are contemporaneously recorded in private documents. So Agnes Smith's marriage to Joseph Smith was recorded in Brigham Young's journal in a Masonic cipher on January 6, 1842. This isn't a source that is used in the 1800s to support the evidence that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. This is something that wasn't really discovered, I understand, or deciphered until the 1980s, if I got my memory right, where somebody finally realized that this was a Masonic cipher and got it to someone who someone who specialized in Masonic ciphers and was able to decipher it. And it just says, "I was taken into the lodge. J. Smith was Agnes S." And so scholars interpret J. Smith was Agnes as referencing Joseph Smith was wedded and sealed to Agnes Smith on this day. And there's other sources in the Nauvoo period about Joseph Smith's marriage to Agnes Smith that we'll get into later. And so Joseph Smith's own journal entry for this day is interesting in that it notes that this was a special or a significant day in the history of the church, relating to the restitution of all things, but it doesn't explicitly state what was so significant about this day, January 6, 1842. But here's an excerpt of that journal entry. Quote, "God has begun to make manifest and set in order in his church those things which have been and those things which the ancient prophets and wise men desired to see, but died without beholding them. A day in which those things begin to be made manifest, which have been hid from before the foundation of the world, and which Jehovah has promised should be made known in his own due time unto his servants, to prepare the earth for a return of his glory, even a celestial glory, and a kingdom of priests and kings to God and the Lamb forever on Mount Zion, and with him the 144,000 whom John the Revelator saw, all of which is to come to pass in the restitution of all things." So interesting journal entry mentioning that there was something significant about that day in relating to the restitution of all things. So the next marriage that is recorded in a contemporaneous document is the Sarah Ann Whitney marriage, which was in a Revelation and Journal document that was passed down the Newell K. Whitney family. The provenance isn't clear on this document, but it's clearly referencing Nauvoo era concepts. And when you take the text of the document and everything that's included in it, it's a very compelling and interesting document. And I could do a whole power presentation arguing why this is a contemporaneous Nauvoo document, and this might be another presentation in and of itself. But anyhow, so Wednesday, 27th July, 1842. I quote the whole text of the Revelation right here, but significantly it says, "They shall take each other by the hand, and you shall say, you both mutually agree, calling them by name, to be each other's companions, so long as you both live, preserving yourselves for each other and from all others, and also throughout eternity, reserving only those rights which have been given to my servant Joseph by revelation and commandment and by legal authority in times past. If you both agree to covenant to do this, then I give you Sarah Ann Whitney, my daughter, to Joseph Smith to be his wife, to observe all the rights between you that belong to that condition." So this is a significant and interesting document. And on the back, it's kind of a journal of events the next month, rebaptisms, and further blessings that Joseph would confer on Newell K. Whitney and Elizabeth Ann Whitney. So Lucy Walker is another one that's in a contemporaneous journal. This is in William Clayton's journal in May 1st, 1843. And this is significant. It's a very, if you look, I have it highlighted. There's a very tiny portion of this journal that references it at 10 MJ2LW. It's in code, but it's at 10 a.m. I married Joseph to Lucy Walker, is what William Clayton would later testify occurred on that day. And you also have Lucy Walker's own testimony about being one of Joseph Smith's plural wives. And we can know that this is a contemporaneous Nauvoo journal is because there's a trace of the Kinderhook plate on the very next page. And they were only in Nauvoo for a short period of time, and they weren't ever in early Utah. And so that's how you know that that is a contemporary document. So the next document is Rhoda Richards, being the note of her being sealed to married to Joseph Smith, which was in Joseph Smith's journal on June 12th, 1843, written in Taylor shorthand in the middle of this journal entry. So again, they're trying to keep there's some of these contemporary records, but they're still trying to keep it coded and secret, just like with the William Clayton journal, just like with the Agnes Smith marriage recorded in Brigham Young's journal. And so it's written in Taylor shorthand, and when you decode it, it says married to R. Rids, which is Rhoda Richards, and Willard Richards married to Susan Liptroth. And that's in Joseph Smith's journal for June 12th, 1843. So Melissa Lott's marriage to Joseph Smith is another marriage that is recorded in a contemporary document in the Lott Family Bible on September 20th, 1843. And it records Cornelius P. Lott married to Permelia Daros for time and eternity, September the 20th, 1843, by President Hiram Smith, with seal of President Joseph Smith. September the 20th, C.P. Lott and Permelia Lott gave their daughter Melissa to wife, but they don't say who they're giving her to wife to because they're wanting to, keep it secret that she was being a plural wife of Joseph Smith. And she would later give her testimony about being Joseph Smith's plural wife as well. So getting into antagonistic contemporary sources, John C. Bennett, interestingly, is not a reliable source generally, but interestingly, he correctly identifies 5 of Joseph Smith's plural wives and 2 other polygamy insiders in 1842. And so this is most of what John C. Bennett says about plural marriage is out in the night and totally ridiculous, and you should take him with a grain of salt. But this very interesting excerpt listing wives, and in 2 cases, the men who performed the plural marriages, is very significant. He blacks out the names except for the initials, but gives you the exact number of letters in each name so you can identify who he's referencing. Quote, I will semi-state 2 or more cases among the vast number where Joe Smith was privately married to his spiritual wives. In the case of Mrs. Agnes Smith, by Apostle Brigham Young. In the case of Miss L.B., Louisa Beeman, by Elder Joseph Bates Noble. Then there are the cases of Mrs. Buell, Mrs. Durfee, Mrs. Sessions, Mrs. G, and Mrs. B, and et cetera, et cetera. And the last 2 are unknown. I speculate that Mrs. G is Mrs. Sarah Granger Kimball, because she is listed as in Oliver Onley's list of alleged wives of Joseph Smith. But she interestingly says that Joseph tried to teach her plural marriage, and she rejected it and told him to teach it to someone else. So she came to Utah. She was a faithful member of the church, but rejected plural marriage and was in a Relief Society presidency in early Utah, as I understand it. And so then the last one, Miss B, might have been accidentally listing Louisa Beeman twice, but significantly, he correctly identifies Agnes Smith, Louisa Beeman, Crescenda Huntington Buell, Elizabeth Davis Durfee, and Patty Sessions as wives of Joseph Smith, with 2 unknown individuals, and references 2 men who were polygamy insiders, Brigham Young and Joseph Bates Noble. And this is published in 1842 by John C. Bennett. So Agnes Culber Smith's marriage to Joseph Smith is corroborated by Brigham Young's January 1842 journal entry in Masonic cipher, and she's confirmed as a polygamy insider by her choosing to be sealed to George A. Smith as a plural wife in the Nauvoo Temple on January 26, 1846. So they're all of these wives that he lists significantly and interestingly are all resealed to Joseph Smith in the Nauvoo Temple in early 1846, except Agnes Smith, who's sealed to Don Carlos for eternity and George A. Smith for time, and Patty Sessions, who later in June of 1860 in her journal noted that she still needed to have her marriage sealing to Joseph Smith ratified in a temple because all ordinances performed outside of a temple needed to be ratified in a temple, was what the doctrine was. And the Nauvoo Temple sealings record, this was a private sacred record. This wasn't something that would ever be used as evidence for these people being wives because it was a private sacred temple record. But it is a significant contemporary Nauvoo source that these women were sealed as wives to Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. And we're going to talk about the Nauvoo Temple record near the end of this presentation. So besides John C. Bennett, Oliver Onley correctly identifies wives in late 1843 in a note he takes. His wife was a secretary for the Relief Society in 1843, and she must have been, probably was his informant trying to figure out who were Joseph Smith's plural wives, because Oliver Onley believed that church leaders were teaching polygamy and was trying to find out details on the wives of church leaders. And so he significantly gets all the wives he lists correct, except for Mrs. Granger, Sarah Granger Kimball, who significantly says that no, she wasn't a wife of Joseph Smith, but that in early 1842, Joseph tried to teach her the doctrine of plural marriage. So he lists Louisa Beeman, Agnes Smith, Eliza R. Snow, Emily Partridge, Eliza Partridge, Sylvia Lyons, and Patty Sessions as plural wives of Joseph Smith. And this is not the same list as Bennett, because he's missing two wives that Bennett lists, and then he's got three wives that Bennett doesn't have. So Oliver Onley correctly named 7 of Joseph Smith's wives. So another significant apostate source, antagonistic source, obviously, about Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage is Buckeye's Lamentation for Want of More Wives, published in the Warsaw Signal in February of 1844, probably by Wilson Law or one of the Higbees, I understand. But it's got a lot of very interesting details about the doctrines related to plural marriage, and it's a very long, creative poem. I'm just going to quote several verses of it that are significant. And 'tis here in this sad life, such ills you may endure, some priest or king may claim your wife because that you are poor. A revelation he may get, refuse it if you dare, and you'll be damned perpetually by our good Lord the Mayor. But if you yield willingly your daughters and your wives in spiritual marriage to our Pope, he'll bless you all your lives. He'll seal you up, be damned you can't, no matter what you do. If that only you stick to him, he swears he'll take you through. And thus all the 12 do slyly teach and slyly practice too, and even the sage patriarch won't have untied his shoe. For sure 'twould be quite impolite, if not a great disgrace, to have a widow sister fair spit in a prophet's face. But Joe at snaring beats them all, and all the rest does laugh. For widows, poor, and orphans girls he can ensnare with chaff. He sets a snare around for all, and very seldom fails to catch some thoughtless partridges, snowbirds, or nightingales. And so that's identifying in that paragraph with the italics, the Partridge sisters as being plural wives to Joseph Smith, Eliza R. Snow as being a plural wife to Joseph Smith, and Martha McBride Knight as being a wife of Joseph Smith. And she was a widow. So he's saying widows and orphans are being sealed as wives to Joseph. Makes a reference to Hiram Smith being involved in plural marriage, that he did a levirate marriage in verse 11. It references that. We'll talk about that later on in the summary. And it also references this concept of these dynastic marriages that were occurring in Nauvoo, of men's wives either being sealed to Joseph Smith by revelation or daughters being sealed to Joseph Smith to create dynastic family ties to the prophet. And Sarah Ann Whitney was one example of that, and there are many other examples. So to get into some of these examples confirming different things that were alleged by Buckeye's lamentation. Some priest or king may claim your wife because that you are poor. Revelation he may get. Refuse it if you dare, and you'll be damned perpetually by our good Lord the Mayor. So this is John Hawley in his autobiography in January 1885, recalling that when he was in early Utah, he recalled that Wilford Woodruff told him that when Brigham Young got the records of the church after the death of Joseph Smith, he was found by examination that there were a number of men who had their wives sealed to Joseph Smith. So it says, quote, when Brigham Young got the records of the church in his hands after the death of Joseph Smith, he found by examination that his first wife had been sealed to Joseph, and that William Law's wife and Francis Higby's and Lyman White's wife and Robert D. Foster's wife had all been sealed to Joseph, as their husbands could not save them. Hawley commented, why Wilford Woodruff told me this, I could not say. So that's in John Hawley's autobiography manuscript, January 1885, in the Community of Christ Library Archives. So the next verse, but if you yield willingly your daughters and your wives in spiritual marriage to our Pope, he'll bless you all your wives. So all your lives, excuse me. So there's a lot of significant evidence of these dynastic family marriages that were done, from Sarah Ann Whitney as an example, and Helen Mar Kimball was another significant example. And some try to say Helen Mar Kimball's testimony is late, but Catherine Lewis, significantly, in when she stayed in the Kimball home in 1845, she said that Heber C. Kimball was trying to court her to be a plural wife, even though she didn't want to be a plural wife, but she was living in their home. And that while she was living in their home in 1845, she learned about Helen Mar Kimball, the daughter of Heber C. Kimball, was one of Joseph's wives, and that Helen Mar Kimball had a negative attitude of it at this time. This is obviously a hostile, antagonistic source, so you got to take it with that's coming from that lens, but it's still significant, and that was published in 1848 before polygamy was even publicized in early Utah. So she wrote, quote, the 12 took Joseph's wives after his death. Kimball and Young took most of them. The daughter of Kimball was one of Joseph's wives. I heard her say to her mother, I will never be sealed to my father, meaning as a wife, and I would never have been sealed married to Joseph had I known it was anything more than a ceremony. I was young, and they deceived me by saying that the salvation of our whole family depended on it. I say again, I will never be sealed to my father. No, I would sooner be damned and go to hell if I must. Neither will I be sealed to Brigham Young. So basically, she's saying, I will not be married for time to any church leader. And they ultimately conceded that, and she ended up being married to Heber C. Kimball's oldest son, if I understand correctly. So then she goes on, the apostles said they only took Joseph's wives to raise them up children, carry them through to the next world, and there deliver up to him. By so doing, they should get his approbation, etc. And so that's Catherine Lewis's A Narrative of Some of the Proceedings of the Mormons, which is an anti-Mormon tract on page 19 in 1848. So contemporary documents regarding Sarah Ann Whitney, who was married to Joseph Smith on July 27th, 1842, indicate blessings were sealed upon the heads of her parents for entering into a dynastic marriage to Joseph Smith, And a blessing by Joseph Smith to her on March 23rd, 1843 states that, quote, all her father's house shall be saved as she continued faithful in the everlasting covenant. And so, that's, that this is significant. The documents relating to Sarah Ann Whitney are significant because this one, it's an unknown scribe, unknown provenance, but it's just been passed down and is in the church archives. But we have the letter by Joseph Smith to the Whitneys in August of 1843, alluding to the marriage that had just recently occurred. And then, and this is one of the rare documents in his own handwriting. Then we also have this patriarchal blessing to Sarah Ann Whitney by Joseph Smith in March of 1843, also written in his own handwriting, which is another significant reference to her plural marriage to Joseph Smith. So, but if you yield willingly your daughters and your wives in spiritual marriage to our Pope, he'll bless you all your lives. So wives, there were certain faithful brethren who let their wives be sealed up to Joseph Smith by revelation, special revelation, where a lot of these women said that Joseph had said that they were foreordained to be his wives in the eternal worlds, and so they had the sealing done here. For example, Henry Jacob's wife Zena was sealed up as a wife to Joseph Smith, and similarly, Orson Hyde's wife was sealed up as a wife to Joseph Smith. And she interestingly said that Joseph had tried to tell him not to marry her back when they got married in the 1830s, but that Joseph never explained why he told her not to marry him. But yeah, her testimony is significant. We'll have to cover her story in a future video. But anyhow, this is John D. Lee saying, report said Orson Hyde's wife, with his consent, was sealed to Joseph for an eternal state. But I do not assert the fact. I also understood Brigham Young's wife was likewise sealed to Joseph. Shortly before the death of Joseph, Brigham told me that Joseph's time on earth is short and that the Lord allowed him privileges that we could not have. And so John D. Lee, interestingly, apostatizes because in Utah Mormonism and writes, his antagonistic Life and Confessions, but he still attributes plural marriages starting with Joseph Smith. And he talks about how he learned about it as a Nauvoo policeman in Joseph Smith's lifetime. And his testimony was compelling enough that it was either Jason Briggs, I believe it was Jason Briggs, thought that this proves that Joseph Smith was involved with polygamy if John D. Lee gave personal witness to learning of it from Joseph Smith in Joseph Smith's lifetime. So anyhow, but that's some examples of men who had their wives sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, such as Orson Hyde. So the last piece of evidence I'm going to talk about is the Nauvoo Temple Book of Proxy Sealings, which is, again, a private temple record that wasn't used as evidence in the 1800s, but is compelling evidence that these marriages existed in the Nauvoo period, and they were not later Utah fabrications. And so this is published in the book, The Nauvoo Endowment Companies is what I went through to get these, but there's also several other books that also published all these sealings that occurred in the Nauvoo Temple. I just went through and I collected all the times that women were sealed to Joseph Smith. So there was over 1,300 sealings, eternal marriages performed in the Nauvoo Temple from January 7th to February 8th, 1846. And 206 of them were proxy sealings. And 26 women who were proxy sealed to Joseph Smith. And this is because all ordinances performed outside of temples needed to be ratified in a temple. So just going over chronologically, Monday, January 12th, 1846, Sarah Ann Whitney sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Heber C. Kimball for time. Eliza Partridge, January 13th, 1846, was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Amass Lyman for time. January 14th, Louisa Beeman and Emily Partridge sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, sealed to Brigham Young for time. January 15th was some other Olive Andrews and Sarah M. Kingsley sealed to Joseph Smith and to other husbands for time. Lucy Walker was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Heber C. Kimball for time. January 17th, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity and to Brigham Young for time. Continuing Thursday, January 22nd, 1846, Elizabeth Davis Durfee was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Cornelius LOTT for time. And Lucinda Pennington Harris was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to George Harris for time on that day. January 26, 1846, Dulcina D. Johnson was sealed to Lyman Sherman for eternity, to Alman Babbitt for time. So she was her brother Benjamin F. Johnson testified that he learned from Joseph Smith that she was a plural wife to him. And so she ended up becoming a plural wife to Alman Babbitt after Joseph Smith's death. So that shows that she was still a polygamy insider, even though she was a 4-time wife to Joseph Smith, and sealed to Lyman Sherman for eternity. So Monday, January 26, 1846, Desdemona Fulmer was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Ezra T. Benson for time. Agnes Culber Smith was sealed to George A. Smith for time only. Martha McBride Knight, Sylvia Lyon, and Sarah Lawrence were sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Heber C. Kimball for time. And then, there's Tuesday, January 27th, 1846, Sophia Sandsberg was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Gad Yell for time. Cornelia C. Morley to Joseph Smith for eternity, Frederick Cox for time. So there's some women that there's not clear enough evidence whether they were actually a wife of Joseph Smith in his lifetime. I understand Lucinda Harris is one that's questionable, and maybe I shouldn't have bolded her as an example. So you could, maybe lower my list to one -1 if you want to say that she's a questionable alleged wife. But continuing, Agnes Culbreth was sealed to Don Carlos Smith for eternity, with George A. Smith standing proxy on January 27th, 8th, 1846. January 31st, 1846, Rhoda Richards was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Brigham Young for time. Monday, February 2nd, 1846, Zena Dinah Huntington to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Brigham Young for time. Henry B. Jacobs expresses willingness that it should be so in the presence of these witnesses. Tuesday, February 3rd, 1846, Nancy Winchester to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Heber C. Kimball for time. Eliza R. Snow sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Brigham Young for time. Marianne Houston to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Heber C. Kimball for time. Elvira A. Coles to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Jonathan Coles for time. Helen Mar Kimball, February 4th, 1846, was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Horace K. Whitney for time. Priscinda L. Huntington Buell to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Heber C. Kimball for time. Then February 5th, 1846, Mary Ann Frost sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, to Parley P. Pratt for time. And then February 8th, 1846, Melissa Lott and Permelia Darrow Lott to Joseph Smith for eternity, to John Bernheisel for time. And so Mary Ann Frost, I think, is another one that you could put into the questionable category on evidence whether she was actually a wife of Joseph Smith in his lifetime. But in summary, 5 wives' marriages to Joseph Smith are recorded in contemporaneous records. Agnes Smith, Sarah Ann Whitney, Rhoda Richards, Lucy Walker, and Melissa Lott. Then between John C. Bennett and Oliver Olney and Buckeye's Lamentation, 10 wives of Joseph Smith are contemporary identified by antagonistic sources in his lifetime. Agnes, Louisa Beeman, Lucinda Huntington Buell, Elizabeth Davis Durfee, Patty Sessions, Eliza R. Snow, Emily Partridge, Eliza Partridge, Sylvia Sessions, and Martha McBride Knight. Then Mercy R. Thompson's plural marriage for time to Hiram Smith as a widow is contemporaneously identified by Buckeye's Lamentation in verse 11. And so this is significant. This is something that I actually just barely learned about the other day. It was just barely pointed out to me. And so this was pointed out by a commentator on the Debunking Polygamy Denial page. The comment said, Mercy Thompson's levirate marriage to Hiram Smith is also alluded to by the anti-Mormon poem Buckeye's Lamentation for More Wives, probably by Francis Higby, published in the Warsaw Signal, February 7th, 1844. Thus, all the 12 do slyly teach and slyly practice too, and even the sage patriarch won't have to untie his shoe, for sure 'twas be quite impolite, if not a great disgrace, to have a widow sister fair spit in a prophet's face. And so that's verse 11. And the commentator said, the language refers, of course, to the ritual of humiliation stipulated for a man who refuses to raise up seed to his dead brother. And this is in Deuteronomy 25, verses 7 through 10. And if a man like not to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go into the gate unto the elders and say, my husband brother refuseth to raise up unto his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak unto him. And if he stand to it and say, I would like not to take her, then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders and loose his shoe from off his foot and spit in his face, and shall answer and say, so shall be done unto that man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. So this clever verse 11, references that Hiram Smith, the sage patriarch, won't have to untie his shoe because won't have untied his shoe because he entered into a levirate marriage by marrying Robert Thompson's widow, Mercy R. Thompson. So we have an additional 21 wives that you could lower that to 19 if you want to question some of the ones that are identified that don't have strong evidence, but at least, around 20 wives are confirmed by their participation in private Nauvoo Temple sealing rituals in January and February of 1846. So there is quite a number of significant contemporary evidence for a lot of these plural wives of Joseph Smith. And it's just even further reinforced when you count these women's testimonies and other participants' testimonies later on when they do all their affidavits and they write their records and autobiographies that go into a lot of this stuff. So that ends this lesson. If you appreciate the content, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you appreciate the content. And I'll see you in the next video.